approval of meeting minutes. The first minutes are the regular meeting for September 20th, 2018. Has everyone had a chance to look at them? Any changes, corrections? Could I have a motion to adopt them?
I'll move we accept the minutes as written.
Second.
Mr. Johnson moved, seconded by Ms. Hogue. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? So approved. The second are the meeting minutes for the October 30th special meeting. I just noticed one thing. There's a right under call to order. Vice Chair Wyatt called the September 20 meeting to order. That just needs to be deleted. I think it was just a carryover from the prior minute. Is everyone had a chance to read these? Any changes or corrections other than what we talked about? We have a motion.
I move to accept the minutes as amended.
Ms. Welder moved to accept the minutes.
Second.
Mr. Atkinson seconded. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? All right. The next item on the agenda is citizen communication. This is an opportunity for anyone in the audience who would like to address the commission on items that are not on the agenda today. Mayor Polaski.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Planning Commission. I'm only here for one simple thing. I had some meetings next door, and City Manager mentioned reminded me you were meeting today, and I just came by to thank you with all sincerity for your service to your community on Planning Commission. And I do apologize. I missed the joint meeting we had. I had Family Matters, but I really was looking forward to that, and I didn't get to be there with you all to hear all the comments and discussion. And matter of fact, I'm still a little behind the curve on that, but I know that you guys have done a wonderful job, put in a lot of effort. Now, I was kidding with one or two of you earlier that your experience on Planning Commission does make you perfect candidates for City Council someday. So don't rule that out. But I myself spent 6 years on Planning Commission and various other boards, and I do know that Planning Commission is the one that you sometimes have to make a hard decision. And Mr. Davis, I think you made the comment about you're going to spend your first paycheck on a vacation. Christmas, right? Your first.
Right. If I get one.
That's right, and we know what the answer to that is. You're not going to get one, and you do it all out of the goodness of your heart and the care for your community, and it doesn't go unnoticed. And I really appreciate it, your service. So thank you.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Appreciate it. Okay, the first item on the agenda is a variance request for Spring Ridge subdivision, resub number 2. Can we have the staff report, please?
Yes, good evening, Commission. You may be wondering why I'm here instead of Celeste. I just want to make a quick announcement that she has moved over to be our Community Development Planner and will be administering the Community Development Block Grant Program. So we're very excited for that move. And so that means tonight you have me. So this first variance request is for a plat that was submitted for the Spring Ridge subdivision, re-subdivision number 2. The applicant is requesting interior side setback variances to go down to as little as 2.5 feet for an interior side building line. The staff recommends approval of this variance to waive the single-family residential detached rural subdivision minimum interior side yard setback, finding that this property is in the ETJ. It's at 97 Brookview. It's approximately 1.07 acres in size. And so that large rural lot, low-density rural residential use really makes for plenty of open space and single-family residential setbacks are in place to promote open space and prevent a minimum separation of buildings. And so because of the low-density character of the subdivision, we do recommend approval of the variance. And I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Anybody have any questions?
We got a lot of information. Do you want to elaborate on any of that?
Yes, thank you for reminding me of
Please.
that. Yes, the commission was emailed quite a few letters from neighboring property owners that included a lot of information. The Planning Commission is only looking at the setback variance. associated with the plat. As you know, as we've gone through all of this training with the Chapter 211, Chapter 212, the city only has authority for the platting requirements out in the ETJ. So we do not regulate any sort of building or construction activity in the ETJ. So we look at plats only, and in this plat, we're looking at a variance for 2.5-foot setback. So if there's any other issues, building encroachments or construction-related issues to the property, those would need to be enforced privately through the deed restrictions, or if there's any easements that the county may have, the county could potentially enforce any violations related to that. Because the city has no authority on any of the construction or building activities, we are just looking at the plat. And is a setback of 2.5 feet appropriate, or as little as 2.5 feet appropriate or not, is for what the commission is being asked to decide tonight. Does that help answer the question?
Yeah, sure, sure.
Do we actually have the authority to even move on this?
Yes, so the applicant has submitted a request for a replat, which is something that the Planning Commission is in your peer review, and associated with that replat is a variance for the setbacks. So our code does line out minimum setback requirements that must be shown on plats, and whenever a plat is submitted that doesn't meet those minimum requirements, and the applicant can request a variance to vary from those minimum requirements, in which they have done that. So the commission would need to act on the variance.
But that should have been done before, normally, correct?
Well, I think the reason this is a little different from what we've had in recent weeks, a lot of times we get a request for a variance, and then we also adopt a plat. But in this case, I think it's considered a minor plat, since it's only a replat of one lot. So in this case, we're just being asked to up or down on the variance, and then if the variance is approved, they can approve it as a minor plat. So the plat wouldn't necessarily come to us, it'll go to the city council.
Yes, and it's not a building or site plan, it is a plat. So it's laying out, the configuration of the lot.
And I think this came up, as I read through everything, because of a proposed sale, and I think the mortgage company was asking that this be done because it came up as an exception on a title policy. This is not really uncommon. We have seen it a lot in lots of communities across Texas, and invariably the variance is granted.
Well, then I beg the question, why did we get all these documentation? What's out there that's
Well,
caused
I
a
think,
lot of concern?
Mr. Hack, I think maybe we should go on with the public hearing, and
Okay.
and I suspect your answers will come,
All righty,
if that's okay.
sounds good.
Are you finished with the?
Yes, unless you have any other
Okay, at
questions.
this time, we'll call for the public hearing on this particular agenda item. Is there anyone in the audience that would like to address the commission? And I would ask that you try to hold your comments to 3 to 5 minutes, if you could. Yes, sir. If you would approach the podium and give us your name and your address, please, sir.
Yes, so my name is Grant Van Meter. I want to thank you for the opportunity to come here tonight and voice my public opposition to the variance. My wife and I purchased our home, immediately adjacent and most affected by the situation. And we purchased the home in November of 2016. What really attracted us to the neighborhood was the space between the properties. As you know, in Victoria, a lot of the subdivisions are house on house. You look behind, over the fence, and there's your neighbor's backyard. And so that was appealing to us. So we purchased the home. Within the next year, our neighbors put their home up for sale due to a job opportunity for him. And so on August 26th, Bob Schaefer, the person asking for the variance, came to me and said he was going to buy the home, but he said that he was going to build a metal shop. And I told Bob specifically that this is a deed restricted neighborhood, that whatever the deed restrictions require, that's what he can build. And so I also made aware the HOA president, Brad Blanton, aware of the situation. And so whatever happened between Brad and Bob, I'm not keen on. But Bob ended up building his shop, starting that following January. And there were a lot of issues that my wife and I endured. And then since then, we've found out, we trusted the HOA president that he was going to do his due diligence when approving it, the building. Bob, he's an engineer by trade, and so it's my feeling that he should have known better if he was prudent about building the shop the size that he did. It's a constrained area, and he wanted to build right on the building line. And in order to build right on the building line without making any mistakes, any prudent person would know that a survey is required. And he didn't get a survey. And then since then, a survey's been done, which has been provided to you, and he was over on the survey line. And there's other issues with safety, with propane tanks. There's issues with the sanitation easement in the front of the garage and his driveway. And so I'm asking tonight for you to look on the situation. How can the Urban Commission grant a waiver when they don't have the authority to force a survey, but then when somebody makes a mistake because they didn't get a survey, then that person then can go to the Urban Planning Commission and ask for an out? That makes no sense to me, illogical, and my time is up. So,
Does anybody have any questions?
So this is the building line that we're talking about from the property, that edge of the property?
Well, as platted, and I think that's why they provided a copy of the plat, as platted on the plat, there's a 5-foot side building line
Okay.
on each side of the lots. And my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, is that the garage that was built mistakenly is 2.5 feet into the one side 5-foot building setback.
Right.
And basically, the variance is being requested to basically make the property sellable so that a title company will insure it without the variance being shown as an objection on Schedule B.
And there's some safety issues involved with getting it that close? Fire?
Would you let us discuss it, and if someone needs to ask it in 1 minute? Yes, sir, please. I think there were some issues raised in the materials that we received, but those issues really are not our purview. I mean, our purview is to make a decision as to whether or not the variance request meets our 5 requirements for granting a variance, and if it does, then we can grant the variance.
Is there a homeowners association out there?
I believe there is a homeowners association.
Did they give the variance?
No, their deed restrictions also have a 5-foot side,
Well, that's.
but he didn't go. I think that what happened was he didn't realize he had violated the restriction until the building was already built.
Mr. Davis, if I can also help answer that question. Excuse me, I'm sorry. Frog in my throat.
Oh, good, I'm sorry.
The issue of whether or not the homeowners association has approved a variance to their deed restrictions is a separate issue that is not before this board. Your decision at this point is to determine whether or not the variance to the plat is appropriate, all right? I know that there was a question about safety as well, and Julie may want to address the fire issues that may or may not be at that location.
So generally, there's a 3-foot rule of thumb between structures. And to my knowledge, there's no other structure that is within, but of course, those can be reduced down based on the different materials that are used. It's my understanding that the existing structure is constructed with a metal roof and hardy plank siding, which has the same R factor as brick. But again, if you apply the other 5-foot setback plus the 2.5 feet, that would be 7.5 feet. And 3 foot is the lowest, or the closest that buildings can be together, generally in the fire code without a full fire rating.
Is that from the wall or is that from the eave, the 2.5 feet?
In the city, you can have, it would be from the wall, and so we would issue a permit and allow up to a 2-foot overhang, but of course, we don't regulate building activities in the county. But in the city, we do we issue or do not issue permits based on the wall.
Normally, that's normal, that's what they are.
That's the standard.
Yes, sir.
How many of the criteria does this person have? Can you speak at the one question I have is, how many of the criteria does a person have to meet in order to be granted a variance?
All 5 of them.
Okay, so this is a self-imposed hardship. This is self-imposed, and
By mistake.
it doesn't matter. It doesn't ask that. It says, is it self-imposed? Yes, it is. He does not meet the criteria, okay? Is it injurious to the surrounding property? Yes, he's affected the grading of the land, and he has his downspouts going into my property and filling my side yard with water, okay? And so it has been injurious to my property, all right? And it's affecting, I have a wooden fence on that side. In the deed restrictions, it says that you're not to alter the grading of the ground and make it any different than was first developed.
Yes, sir, but remember, we're not considering deed restrictions in this meeting.
But
Unfortunately, that's not in our purview.
But you are considering if it is injurious to the surrounding property, and you are also asked if it is self-imposed. My question is it yes or no?
That's a
Yes.
decision for the commission, to make.
Yes,
Yes,
ma'am.
sir.
Thank you.
If I may, Commissioners, I'm going to take a step back and let's talk about procedural running of the meeting. I know several of us are new and have new roles in the meeting. At this point on the agenda officially, if we're following Robert's rules, we are still technically within the public comment section, and we typically allow people to speak one time and one time only. So it might be advisable, Madam Chair, if you want to simply ask if there are others who would like to speak at this time. And if not, then we would normally close public hearing and allow the commission to debate among yourselves.
Can you turn it off?
Thank you.
I'm trying.
Is there anyone else in the audience that would like to address the commission on this agenda item? All right, then we will close the public hearing at this time, and basically discussion is open for the board, the commission.
I want to know, we had a lecture on variances fairly recently and how this is not a hardship, which is self-imposed. I mean, mistake or not, I mean, if a survey had been redone, then that incorrect post would have been corrected and this would not have occurred.
The applicant can choose to remedy this
I'm sorry.
encroachment multiple ways. They can choose to purchase additional property. They can choose to move the building. They can choose to seek a variance. And so this is not their only option to remedy the building code violation. So then we look at, is a setback variance appropriate in this case? And again, with the low density in this area and what setbacks typically achieve, we felt that it was not injurious to the surrounding area to have a reduced setback for that small amount of space.
I don't know if the question's been answered, so I have to ask the question, do all 5 of these conditions, are they being met?
According to the staff report, they are.
Well then, how was number 2? What was the logic behind stating number 2 met the variance as it's stated?
As I mentioned, I believe that this variance, or the hardship he has with the building structure and being encroaching in that setback could be solved other ways. This is not the only way for the property owner to solve the encroachment on the building. So again, we go back to looking at the setback and if what's it trying to achieve and what's the goal.
I guess maybe I'm just being dense.
You know, I have a lot of sympathy for all sides of this situation, but I think that some of us can speak to times that we come across these things in the real estate world, and you got to have clear title to get a loan. And you can rebuild the structure, tear it down, move the boundary through agreements with your neighbors, or seek variance. And I think this is one way of accomplishing that can really be the most involving third parties, you know, unimpassioned members and things like that. So I think that what we really need to decide as a commission is whether or not exempting this, the tying to this setback, you know, exempting them from this would really detriment the property, the use of the property, and the use of the neighbor's property. Is kind of where my mind is. So I don't know if that's helpful at all for anybody, but I don't know. I
Well,
don't see it limiting the use.
It's like somebody
specifically.
saying, buy the land, put a house on it, but no, I'm gonna put a beer joint on it, all right? Same thing. They're not following the restrictions.
Well, again, that would be not within the deed restrictions, et cetera. So, you know, I don't know how much we can, I don't know, I guess I don't know how much we can say about what happens in the county. I think it's a hard issue. I don't know.
The problem's not solved whether we grant or don't grant the variance. The structure's still
It's
there, whether
there.
it's sold to someone else or it stays in the same ownership.
Exactly.
The issue still exists, so.
Well, and you can't
So I don't
tear it
know
down too. So
what
it's like-
And
gonna
technically,
accomplish.
you know, and I mean, I just looking at it from a very basic objective, even if you moved that particular structure 2.5 feet, I wouldn't think it's gonna change the downspouts, where the rain goes, those kinds of issues, if you move it 2.5 feet. And in terms of, again, in terms of deed restrictions, that's not what, we need to get away from those because we're not enforcing deed restrictions. And the issue should be is, I'm kind of with you, it is it's a tough call.
hard.
But at the same time, is it really going to be detrimental to a subdivision that's a rural subdivision? People are on acre-plus lots. You know, I sympathize with you, sir, in terms of, you know, having to look out your window and see that garage, but the fact of the matter is, 2.5 feet, you're still going to be looking at that garage, you know, from that standpoint. He's entitled to build it wherever he wants to on his property, and unfortunately made an error. Well, I mean, unfortunately, that's not a decision for us. I mean, this is one of his options, is to ask for this variance. And I think that's what they've done, and we need to consider it and see how everybody feels about it. Anybody else?
I think it would be quite fascinating if the property owner were here to defend his position. And then you should stand up and speak out.
Sure.
Yeah, have an
Well, we've already actually, we called for anyone to come forward during the public hearing section.
Yeah, Mr. Atkinson, we've actually moved past that section of the meeting. However, if you have a specific question, it might be appropriate to let the chair know what your specific question is, and she can ask that question to a member of
Well,
the
I'm
audience.
just
if
making
she
an
would like.
observation.
Okay.
You have a question, or?
Just the observation, I think the property owner should have stood up and said something to defend his position, so it would help us in guiding our decision. That's all. It's just an observation.
From my perspective, I mean, I think we know what happened, and it was a mistake and an error. And the question is, how do you best remedy it to make the property sellable? Anybody else?
Well, like I said, in my background of banking, this has come up quite a bit throughout all communities in Texas, and we've never had a problem getting a variance whenever there had to be one done.
I mean, I'm obviously in the title business also, and I've seen the same thing. And actually, from a title standpoint, even if it's a deed restriction violation that, for whatever reason, is put on Schedule B, if it's been in place for 4 years, it's taken off. So it's when, or a variance, if a variance isn't granted, but it's in place, it's taken away. I mean, they don't put it on anymore. So it does happen more than one would think.
Right.
And I think that's like when people say, well, Joe Blow, my neighbor, did this, and they didn't stop him, and it's going to ruin our restrictions. That's not really the case. It's just that if homeowners association wants to take their action to do something, they have to do it. If they choose not to and let it sit there for 4 years, yes, it is basically, not an objection anymore.
I think that's an interesting piece of this too, is that had this not gone for sale, it may not have been.
It may not have come up for 3 or 4 years.
instance,
You just don't know.
And
Correct.
so on. So, because of the need to sell, here we are. So I think that's interesting to consider.
So denial of the variance request makes the land unsellable?
So
There would be
Gail
other
can speak to this
options.
better, but
Right,
a
right, there'd be other-
lender is having, is taking issue, is
Yeah,
what we're told.
it would be to some lenders.
Yeah,
They would
some
not-
of them don't care.
Yeah,
if
some
it's
don't
unscheduled
care,
B.
but
So-
some would.
The
Other
adjacent
lenders
property
do.
owner's issue is not gonna go away no matter what we do, but the house may or may not be sellable to a,
To someone seeking a loan depending on their lender.
Right.
Right.
But the granting of the variance would take care of that issue.
You know, I'm kind of inclined to move to approve, so I'm going to do so.
But does anybody else have any comments or discussion? All right, now, do I have a motion?
Yes, you do.
Ms. Welders moved to approve the variance. Do I have a second?
Second.
Ms. Hodes has seconded it. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
Opposed?
Aye.
You're aye.
Oppose.
You oppose?
I think
So-
you've got 1, 2, 3.
All right, you got 3. Mr. Davis, Mr. Hike, Mr. Roberts, or in
Johnson.
opposition. Mr. Johnson, sorry. Robert Roberts?
I get worse.
Okay. And by my count, the variance has been adopted, approved.
That will be forwarded to the city council for final approval. Our second variance request of the night is actually for quite a few variances. We actually have two types of variances for this next request. The first set of variances are to Chapter 20, which is our driveway ordinance. And Chapter 20 is very different than Chapter 21, our subdivision ordinance, in that there is no criteria for the commission to consider these variances for. So the issue at hand is McDonald's is proposing to demolish their existing building and rebuild their property on the same site. In doing so, the non-conforming driveways are required by code to come into conformance. So McDonald's has 2 driveways when they're the current regulations would only permit them to have 1 driveway, and those 2 driveways are too close together. So if the commission chooses to approve or deny the driveway variances, there are no criteria to consider. So driveway regulations are intended to promote safety, and then as well as provide all of the conflicts on site rather than in the right-of-way, which is, again, what helps promote safety. In this situation, you do have the median on Navarro Street, and then you are located directly north of a signalized intersection, which is between LaSalle Crossing, which is a city street, the mall's private drive, and then Navarro Street. So safety considerations are not very strong here. We feel like with the low speed and the limitations that the median places on turning movements, you do have a fairly safe situation. The other part of the driveway ordinance relates to capacity and how quickly or how the road that the property is adjacent to functions. And so 2 driveways does allow for more turning movements and could provide more conflicts and slow down the capacity of Navarro Street. So those are considerations for the driveway variance. The other variances are to Chapter 21. We have a building setback variance, which is a 3-foot canopy encroachment into the front setback. As I was explaining earlier, our code allows for up to a 2-foot overhang. So if you apply the 2-foot overhang into the 3-foot canopy encroachment, we're looking at an additional 1-foot encroachment into the front setback than what's allowed by code. The other variances are to the off-street parking requirements and the queuing spaces. The proposed additional square footage to this property, when they propose to rebuild, they're proposing to rebuild by approximately 884 square feet, I believe. And so that would bump up the parking requirements to, I believe it's 43 parking spaces. And they're only proposing to provide 36. In addition to not having enough off-street parking, they would be blocking some of their required parking with the queuing space, which is not allowed by code. In this instance, I mean, we all know that McDonald's is a convenience-type drive-through business, and so staff believes that if there's not the adequate parking, their customers will just continue on. But what makes it really unique is that they have a very, very broad access agreement with the mall, and they have that rear drive to the mall. And it doesn't explicitly state that they customers can park there, but it's such a broad access easement, it gives all of McDonald's customers rights to be utilizing the mall property. And then the last variance that they are requesting is to the required amount of landscaping supposed to be in the front of the property. They are proposing to provide all of the required square footage of landscaping, but 70% of that landscaping must be located in the front street yard. In this instance, they are proposing to reduce that amount. However, they are proposing to landscape the entire length of the Mall Street Drive, which in staff's opinion functions as a city street. It's a signalized intersection. I think most citizens would actually not realize that that is not a city street there. And so the purpose of landscaping the front street yards is to make sure that we don't have barren corridors. And in this instance, staff believes that continuing that landscaping down that Mall Street yard, which is technically a side yard, would meet the intent of the code. So for those reasons, staff does recommend the Chapter 21 variances for approval. And I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Point of information, are we going to take this by chapter, or are we taking this by variance, or how are we going to do this?
Do you need a motion on each, or can we put
I would
everything in one
recommend
motion?
separating the driveway and
So by
the
chapter?
Subdivision variances, just because your subdivision variances, if you choose to accept staff's recommendation, they would be based off of the criteria that staff has found, or if you choose to offer criteria of your own, you would need to do that with the Chapter 21 variances, whereas the Chapter 20 variances is just the commission's wishes.
So basically have two motions, one on the Section 20, Chapter 20 variances, and one on the 21.
Yes, ma'am. That would be my advice.
Is there any other discussion?
I was just going to say, we've approved variances for some of these items before.
Well, I mean,
So
just
there's
my,
precedents out there. at
my
least.
own observation, they do back up almost into the street at certain hours of operation there. So if this is going to relieve that, I would think it would be a good
And
good
this
move.
is a variance request too, so we would also need public hearing.
Do you have a motion on approving the Chapter 20 variance? Oh,
Yeah,
public hearing, sorry.
hearing.
Let's open it up for a public hearing. Is there anyone that'd like to address the commission? Yes, sir. If you'd just come up and give us your name and address, please.
My name is Nathan Billett, 15 Champions Court Trail, Houston, Texas. I'm with Pape Dawson Engineers. I'm the engineer of record, and I'm here to answer any questions you have. I would like to talk a little bit about the two driveways. Our main concern is we'd like to keep the existing driveways because we have to service this building with the 18-wheeler. And to get the 18-wheeler on and then circle around and get off, it's going to make it very difficult for us to pinch an 18-wheeler on such a small site with just one driveway. The other thing talked about the queuing, I just want to talk about that. We're proposing to put in a double drive-through lane, which extremely gets cars on and off the property a lot quicker. So the biggest deal for us, and the other thing is with the driveways, adding more volume to the street. The way McDonald's has the parking angled, cars are gonna come in the southernmost, go to their drive-through. They're gonna park at a 60-degree angle and then circle around and pull out the northernmost driveway. So in retrospect, they'd be seeing the same amount of volume, in my point of view. that they would. It's kind of a right in, right out. The other thing is the median is raised, so it would eliminate any left turn
Cutting
traffic at all.
across.
So, but I'll also be here if you have any other questions that you might need answered. And McDonald's is also here as well, if you have any questions for McDonald's.
Does anybody have any other questions of the gentleman? Would anyone else like to speak during the public hearing section? Seeing no one else, I guess we'll close the public hearing and open discussion for the commission. Any comments, questions?
Will we approve the request for driveway variance?
Okay, so that would be on the Chapter 20 variance.
Yes.
There's been a motion by Mr. Johnson to approve. Do I have a second?
I'll second.
Seconded by Ms. Welder. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, that one's been adopted. Do I have a motion on the Chapter 21 variance request?
Yeah, I'll make a motion to approve the
Mr.
Chapter
Heitman
21.
To approve. Is there a second?
Second.
Second by Ms. Hode. All in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay. We're now at other business.
Thank you all.
Maybe there's no other business.
So if you don't mind, we'll do our monthly development report first before we get to our other business, which is questions relating to our joint meeting. But as you see, we had sort of a busy month. We had 6 minor plats, major plat, which is major because of the variance. Now the variance, if the variance is approved by council, then it can go back to a minor plat. And then we had 4 site plans that were approved this month. So these 2 variances will be moved to city council action for next month. Next slide, please. And then you'll see our permit activity is under last year, and I think we can all safely say that that's related to the hurricane, especially our permit fees that were collected. So we're back on track. And I'd be happy to answer any questions related to these.
Questions? I don't see any.
Okay. Well, then, our only other business is to have questions and discussion related to the joint meeting that we had with City Council on the Unified Development Code. I think Thomas has a few comments prepared before we get into the questions.
At the joint meeting, you heard a fairly lengthy presentation about the Unified Development Code and how we want to draft that code and what foundation of law we want to use. And I don't intend to go back over all of those comments, all right? You've had some time to think about it. You've had some time to digest. I just want to remind you that the goal that we have tonight is to get feedback from you about whether or not you believe we should proceed with drafting the Unified Development Code under just Chapter 211, which would require additional complication for developers, or whether we should seek additional authorization under Chapter 211, which is called zoning, using that authority to enforce existing zoning regulations rather than adopting zoning maps, right? Remember, did I say 211 twice? I'm sorry. So let me say that all over again.
11.
We currently have 212 on the books, which is subdivision and plating development regulations. And we could continue under that, but of course we would have to add development plats, which would make things more complicated. Or we could adopt Chapter 211, which is the zoning, which would allow direct enforcement authority. And we believe would be easier on developers. So we're just seeking feedback tonight from you guys, additional questions we can answer for you, any comments that you guys might have.
Any comments or questions?
I think it's a positive thing to go both with the zoning reg.
Mr. Davis, did you have something?
I don't like zoning. I don't.
Well, nobody likes the word, that's for sure.
No, that's,
Well, if
to
I can
me, that's a
interject and
no-no.
remind everyone, one more time, we are not talking about a zoning map.
They're not talking about zoning as you think of it when you hear the word. I think they're talking about trying to use the provisions of 211 to make it, actually put our procedures more compatible with,
And streamline.
streamline them, make them more compatible with
Yes.
state law, as well as make it easier for people to maneuver, you know, in terms of the whole picture.
Well, I have a question. How do you enact a zoning law and not have zoning?
The way that you do that is you adopt Chapter 211, but you don't adopt the zoning maps that people think of as they go along with it. So what we would be doing is we would say, similar to, the code currently says this code is adopted under the authority of Chapter 212 of the Local Government Code. It would, in the new version, say adopted under the authority of Chapter 211 and 212. We would follow the procedures for adopting that chapter of the code, but we wouldn't be adding into our code anything with regards to maps or polygons or districts.
Well, what I read here in section 211-006, procedures for governing adoption of zoning regulations and district boundaries. Governing body, municipality wish to exercise authority relating to zoning regulations and zoning district boundaries shall establish procedures for adopting and enforcing regulations and boundaries. So how do you get around not creating boundaries and therefore zoning? When you create the boundaries, then you have to give some designations, do you not?
We're not going to be subdividing the city in any way and creating a district here and a district there. The boundaries in effect would be the city limits.
Can that be put in what you're doing, that we're not going to adopt?
I think we can certainly recite that as a part of the ordinance, that we are not adopting a zoning map or zoning districts as a part of this ordinance.
I feel like between the collaboration of this commission and our council, I don't really have a lot of concerns that it will end up with maps at the end of this, just knowing everyone's feelings about the Z word. So I feel pretty safe about that, but
If it sneaks in, the new code wouldn't be adopted, I don't think.
I don't think anybody is going to pass
And I'd
that,
like to
knowing
make
how
that
people
point.
feel.
Any code we adopt, this is our current code, and there's a lot of language in there. So any code that we adopt will, be out for public consumption well before the adoption process begins.
With multiple hearings, et cetera, correct?
Yes, exactly.
So what I want to know, are you closing the door, or are you leaving the door open for zoning?
Let me say neither. It's a really interesting question. I think people are concerned that if we adopt Chapter 211, or we adopt our zoning regulations under Chapter 211, we're somehow taking a step closer to adopting zoning. And I don't think we are. Today, what it would take to adopt zoning districts is a public hearing and a vote of city council, right? That's how we adopt Chapter 211, and we adopt it with those maps. After we adopt Chapter 211 and go through this process, the step that would be necessary to add the zoning maps on top of it is a public hearing and a vote of city council. We're not any closer procedurally. We're not taking a preliminary step down a road. That's not the goal of this ordinance.
Are there some examples of other cities who have done exactly what you propose?
So again, in the presentation, I talked about form-based zoning, which is actually a lot of cities backtracking from the maps. So very few cities have taken it unilaterally, and a lot of that has to do with, the cost and the amount of work that goes into wholesale readopting a new code. And so you see a lot of baby step backtracking in certain areas. They do the form-based zoning, which us only talks uses aren't categorized of where you can put this use here or this use here. It's the uses can go anywhere as long as you have the amount of parking that's required or the screening fences that are required, all things that we typically have. But as far as cities that don't have zoning of our size, it's us in Houston. And as many of you may know or may not know, Houston has chosen to regulate land use in a lot of different ways that we have not ever chosen to regulate land use with. They enforce deed restrictions. They have special management districts. So they've just gone a different route. And I feel like, honestly, that route can be more cumbersome. So that's why we're proposing to look at the 211 chapter, to look at our current regulations, but make them mesh with state law better.
When we had the joint meeting, the reason I asked the question, because it felt like this was the most like, or could be applied most like what we do now with the subdivision ordinance. And the reason I asked that is not to really specifically say that we should do exactly what we do right now, but I feel like it's less scary when we say, well, we could do something very similar with this way. So I think I'm very supportive of it. I think we could do very similar things than what we do right now, if that's what we choose to do, if that's what the UDC chooses to do, and as we progress all the way through council choose to do. But I do like that it seems to be the least cumbersome for developers. It seems to be the least cumbersome for this commission, and it seems to make the most sense if we want to be simple, you know, and consistent with what our city is accustomed to. So I'm very supportive of it. I'm with you on that.
You raised the point of form-based zoning, and I appreciate what you're trying to express there. But can you show me an example of anywhere in this 211 document of form-based zoning?
I don't think we're there yet. That's my understanding.
I think what you're asking is, does the code specifically use the phrase form-based zoning? And I don't believe it does.
Well, not only that, does it even permit something like that to occur? In other words, are we not subjecting ourselves to some kind of a legal challenge later on? Because the code here clearly states that basically there are very specific things that you have to go through in order to adopt and administer a 211 municipal zoning authority. It's very specific. It doesn't really tell you what to do. It's a nice framework, and apparently you do have quite a bit of versatility underneath it. But it seems like we're trying to find some kind of a half zoning process here that I can't understand the legal basis for this and how it's really going to hold up. And so far as what I think we're all desiring here of, I'll say zoning without zoning, humorously, we're going to be gone one of these days. And one of these days, somebody else is going to pick this up, and they're going to say, we got zoning, brother, get out the map. And we've unleashed something upon ourselves and future generations that perhaps we need to kind of go through this with a little bit more deliberation and understand what we're really getting into here.
Michael, I think Julie just said Houston doesn't have zoning, but they have special use districts. They have, you may not call it a map, but it's a map in a different, without saying map, it's still telling you what you can do with your property.
Mr. Atkinson, the short answer to your question is yes. The code requires a lot of specific procedures to comply with Chapter 211 requirements, and we intend to follow those. But it does not. I like the phrase you used. You said this is a nice framework. And what we're really talking about here, I've used the word foundation, but I think we're speaking the same language here. The foundation, we can build whatever house we want to on top of that foundation. We can use that framework to flesh out whatever regulations, as Ms. Welder was talking about. Those are decisions to be made later. The question right now is, which of those frameworks do we want to build our code upon? And I think I like the way you described that as this is a foundational, a framework issue that we're talking about here.
And I hope not to put you to sleep, but just a little history on land use. You know, land use regulations started with the Great Fire of Chicago in the 1800s, and they started out with the form-based type codes of the setbacks and the, you know, fire codes, and it's sort of all morphed into these different codes, and the actual districts didn't come until much later. So they're these types of rules that are you know, we're saying are zoning, that they also are subdivision, they've they've been in a lot of different zoning ordinances with or without maps throughout the decades.
When you started this, why did you start it? Was it because of law? I heard something about lawsuits, that it would simplify it, so we're not exposed to as many?
No, this process started with the 2030 plan, comprehensive plan for the city. And the fact that developers, I don't want to speak for Julie, but the developers were urging us to simplify our code because it is complicated. It's antiquated. It's been on the books since the early 90s. And this is a process that is trying to bring that code up to modern standards. While we're doing that, we want to also address this underlying foundational issue.
Anybody else? I mean, I think you go ahead and use both chapters, in my opinion, to draft the new code and then be prepared to defend it when the time comes.
What are the next steps?
The next step is that we will do a similar question and response session with City Council next Tuesday night on the 20th, I believe. And we will seek consensus among council members to proceed with drafting it under that, under both authorities, Chapter 211 and 212. And assuming that we get that nod of heads around the table, we're going to then begin the process of drafting that code. Julie has a great outline already created, and then we will start filling in the details based on the authority that council gives us.
Who's
I
gonna
take
do
it
all this
you-
drafting?
Julie?
Who's going to do all this drafting, he asked? You're looking at us.
And the
Are
subcommittee.
you gonna have open
So-
meetings?
So
Are you
as
gonna
far
have?
as the
are you-
actual
I'll
homework,
ask
it'll
him,
be Thomas and myself, but all of those codes will be, fleshed out between the subcommittee, and then once the subcommittee is happy with it, we'll take them to Planning Commission. I don't anticipate working throughout the entire code and then presenting it to Planning Commission and Council and saying, here's the final thing. I don't think that will work. I hope to bring it in more manageable sections so that we can get good feedback as we go through. But we do have a subcommittee that is comprised of both Planning Commissioners and City Councils, and City Council members, and they will be doing the majority of the work with Thomas and I
Writing with the pen.
doing the writing, and they're doing the reviewing.
Are you gonna have public meetings, or are you gonna have public forum for people to come in and talk about what you are drafting?
Yes, we'll have, as we bring the different sections to the Planning Commission and City Council, those will be, of course, public forums. And then as we anticipate, as we get through different sections, having to reach out to different stakeholders, such as developers, builders, commercial real estate developers, those type of stakeholders.
Well, and I know the word has become kind of silly, but the more transparent your process is, I think the better off you are in the long run, and the more that people are apprised as you go along. And I think it's a good idea that as you do sections, let people look at the sections. And then when you do come back with your final document, someone's not going to say, well, whoa, wait a second, I haven't had a chance to go through this. If you do it incrementally like that, it'd be a lot easier for people to understand.
A large amount of work, so it'd be pretty
No, it's a
crushing
lot.
to present a final document that is not approved, so
But do you need a vote from us, or just basically say, get after it?
No, ma'am, we're looking for feedback and questions from you guys. Ultimately, the code will be brought back as an ordinance that'll be adopted by City Council, but we're looking for feedback from everybody as we go through the process.
Anything else? I guess the meeting's adjourned.
You didn't want
Thank you, everyone.
All right, thank you.